尊敬的塞尔温先生，好 ，You can have your earphone on that。尊敬的塞尔温哈特先生，敬爱的谢振华主任，各位来宾、老师们、同学们、校友们、朋友们，大家下午好。欢迎来到第69期气候变化大讲堂。我是清华大学气候变化与可持续发展研究院院长李正。过去一周，我们已经成功地举办2次大讲堂，分别邀请了世界著名企业家以及国际气候变化领域的专家来与大家分享交流。今天，我们又迎来了一位重量级嘉宾。联合国助理秘书长、气候行动和公正转型特别顾问塞尔温哈特先生，让我们以最热烈的掌声欢迎他的到来。我们的大讲堂的创始人谢振华主任也来到了，今天也亲临现场，大家热烈欢迎。同时，我们也欢迎塞尔温哈特先生及他的气候团队一同到来。同时呢，也诚挚欢迎巴巴多斯驻华大使、清华大学校友亨利先生、生态环境部应对气候变化司陆新民副司长和裴亮处长。同时呢，我们的长期合作伙伴。丰田汽车公司小岛和法先生、丰田中央研究院支之明先生一同到来。下面呢，让我们以热烈掌声欢迎谢主任致辞。
非常高兴。回到母校，回到气候变化大讲堂，在这儿呢，非常感谢在座的各位老师、各位同学、各位同行同事，大家呢到大讲堂来一起欢迎哈特先生。我还特别要欢迎一下我的清华校友亨利大使。你这是清华的校友，非常好。今天我们能够在大讲堂见面，我也很高兴。我听说哈特先生刚才李正院长已经介绍了，他是联合国秘书长的气候行动和公正转型的特别顾问，也是助理秘书长。他长期从事气候变化这个工作，他是资深的这个领域的外交官，也是资深的专家。气候变化，它是基于科学、基于规则，在这方面呢，哈特先生都具备这方面的条件，既懂政治又懂外交，还很专业。对很公平公正。他是在处理所有的问题上呢，都能够考虑到世界各国大家的利益。在这一点上呢，他体现了作为一个多边机制的外交官，体现的一个特殊的优秀的素质。他比我年轻，但是在气候这个领域，他比我的资格还要老。他可能从事这个工作已经有25年以上了，曾经是巴巴多斯的气候变化的首席谈判代表，也代表小岛屿国家集团，他也是核心的谈判代表之一。我呢是作为中国的谈判代表，所以我们一起打了很多年的交道。他到联合国工作之后呢，我们联系就更密切了，所以很多多边谈判当中遇到的一些难题难点，有些障碍、有些挑战，我们一起呢经常一起交换意见。 这样的话呢，来解决遇到的一些难题。所以今天我们非常荣幸请到了哈特先生到大讲堂来做一个演讲。他了解这个现在在当前复杂多变的这个地缘政治情况之下，气候变化进程所遇到的一些困难、一些挑战，还取得的一些进展。这个应该说，他对多边的情况非常了解，对各个国家应对气候变化的行动的情况，他也很了解。所以今天请他来，能够就气候变化问题，就多边的进程、各国的表现，而且呢，下一步在这个多边的进程当中如何去做什么，他可能呢要给大家这个做一些演讲。特别是大家很关心COP31，这个马上也要召开了，它要解决什么问题？有哪些问题是最主要的难点？如何解决？怎么解决？可能呢，他也会发表他的一些意见，所以我们特别高兴，这个哈特先生能够到清华来，到大讲堂跟大家呢，我们在座的人不多，但是线上听你这个报告的人很多，所以希望这个你今天的讲演呢，我相信一定非常精彩。给大家提一个建议，他报告之后，大家一定要给他多提问题，这个提一些难题，这个他呢会非常坦诚的跟大家交换意见，把大家所关心的问题呢告诉大家，联合国是怎么考虑的，他是怎么考虑的，这个事本身应该怎么解决，他会坦诚的跟大家交换意见。所以希望大家他发表演讲之后，大家多提问题，这样的话呢，这个把我们这次的演讲搞得更活跃、更有成效、更精彩。谢谢大家。
现在有请哈特先生上台演讲。
Thank you so much, and Professor Lee, I really want to thank you. Ambassador Henry, really great to see you, as well as my colleagues from the Climate Action Team of the Secretary General, Ailun Yang, and my other colleague, TNU, who I don't see at the moment. But I first want to thank all of you at Tsinghua University for your generous hospitality in bringing us together to engage on one of the defining challenges of our time. And to the students joining us today, a special welcome. Let me begin by expressing my sincere appreciation to my friend and mentor, Minister Xinjiahua, for his kind introduction. Minister Xi, your leadership has been instrumental in shaping global climate cooperation, including your pivotal role as an architect of the Paris Agreement. And I am personally grateful for your friendship and guidance and leadership over the years. And it has been a privilege to learn from your experience and your unwavering commitment to multilateralism. And as Minister Xi indicated, we are meeting at a moment of profound geopolitical uncertainty. The world is once again witnessing the consequences of conflict unfold. The conflict in the Middle East is a stark reminder of how deeply our economies and our society remains tied to energy systems built around fossil fuels. And let me be clear from the outset. As the Secretary General recently said, the most immediate priority must be to de-escalate tensions and end the hostilities. Lives must be protected, civilians must be safeguarded, and diplomacy must prevail. This must come first. But even as we focus on ending the conflict, we must also confront a deeper lesson it reveals. When conflict disrupts supply, The effects ripple across the global economy, raising energy prices, driving inflation, straining public financing, and placing immediate pressure on households and businesses everywhere. For many countries, especially across the global south, these translate directly into slower growth, rising debt burdens, disrupted trade, and shrinking fiscal space for the investments their people urgently need. And in responding to these shocks, we must be clear. Short-term measures to stabilize energy markets and economies and to protect the poor and most vulnerable should avoid locking countries into new or expanded fossil fuel infrastructure that will further deepen vulnerability, increase costs over time, and undermine the transition we urgently need. This moment must not be another moment or another cycle of crisis-driven fossil fuel expansion. And at the same time, we're seeing strategic competition between major powers intensifying, and trust between nations is eroding, and multilateral cooperation, that multilateral cooperation that helped us to deliver the Paris Agreement, that multilateral cooperation is under growing strain. But this is the world as it is, turbulent, uncertain, and demanding new solutions. And yet, beneath this turbulence and uncertainty, a profound structural shift is underway. The global clean energy transition is accelerating, and it is becoming one of the most powerful sources of stability and opportunity in a fractured world. Last year, global investment in clean energy exceeded over $2 trillion, more than double the investments in fossil fuels. And last year, the world added close to 700 gigawatts of renewable capacity, the largest expansion in history. And placing this in historical context, in 2015, when the Paris Agreement was finalized, the world added just 150 gigawatts of renewable energy. In 10 years, capacity additions have increased by 4.5 times. And solar power is now the cheapest source of new electricity across the world. And renewables now account for the overwhelming majority of new power capacity globally. And these are not projections, these are market realities. Clean energy is no longer an alternative. Clean energy is dominating. But the deeper driver of this transition is something even more fundamental. The recognition that the global energy system built on fossil fuels creates profound economic and geopolitical vulnerabilities. 3 out of every 4 persons on this planet live in countries that are net importers of fossil fuels. This includes the 1.4 billion people in China, the 1.4 billion citizens of India, and more than 450 million people in the European Union, and over 1 billion people living in the least developed countries. So, in other words, the vast majority of humanity, from the world's largest economies to its most vulnerable nations, remain exposed to fossil fuel markets they do not control. And we have seen these risks repeatedly over the course of the last decades, from the oil shocks of previous decades to the energy crisis triggered by the war in Ukraine to the volatility affecting global markets today. So for most of the world, fossil fuel dependency is not energy security, it's energy insecurity. And this is why the clean energy transition is no longer only a climate story. It is a story about sovereignty, stability, and development. But none of this means that the climate crisis is receding. On the contrary, it is accelerating, and the science is clearer than ever. Evidence linking human activity to the burning of fossil fuels and to rising temperature, this is unequivocal. And yet, at this critical moment in addressing the climate crisis, we're seeing concerted and well-funded efforts by some vested interests to cast doubts on the science, to delay the transition, distort the truth, and prolong the world's dependence on fossil fuels. But the facts are not in doubt, the science is indisputable, and the longer action is delayed, the higher the cost, economic, social, and human. And China's voice in defending the integrity of climate science, anchored in the work of the IPCC, the WMO, and UNEP, will be critical in sustaining trust, guiding policy, and accelerating collective action. And the World Meteorological Organization has recently, as the last few weeks, confirmed that the last 11 years have been the hottest on record. Greenhouse gas concentrations are at a historic high, and the planet is now trapping heat much faster than it can release it. And as a result, we are witnessing more intense heat waves, floods, droughts, storms across every region and on every continent. And the impacts are already devastating lives and livelihoods, disrupting economies, food systems, and infrastructure. So even as the clean energy transition gathers pace, the world remains far from the trajectory needed to limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And scientists now warn that temporary overshoot of this 1.5 degree limit is increasingly likely. However, the choices and the investments made this decade will determine how far temperatures rise, how long they remain over the 1.5 degree limit, and how quickly we can bring them back down. Failure to act, including by dramatically scaling up finance for adaptation and resilience, carries profound consequences for everyone, everywhere. But it's the most vulnerable countries, the small island developing states, which I once had the privilege of representing as a negotiator, as well as the least developed countries. These countries face the greatest risk in the short term, despite having contributed the least to the problem. But the reality is that this is just a short-term risk. Eventually, we're all at risk. Which is why accelerating the energy transition and strengthening climate resilience must move together. And clean energy offers countries the opportunity to generate power from resources they own, such as the sun and wind, rather than relying on fuels imported from distant and volatile markets. The clean energy transition, it represents one of the greatest development opportunities of our time. But this opportunity will only be realized through cooperation and not fragmentation. Cooperation, not fragmentation. And there are powerful interests that benefit from the status quo. They have strong incentives to slow the transition. And we are already seeing this resistance in misinformation about the cost of clean energy, in attempts to undermine the science and frustrate collective action, in fragmented supply chains, and in financial systems that continue to channel capital into fossil fuel expansion. This resistance cannot stop the transition. We've never been more confident that this resistance cannot stop the transition. The economics are too powerful and the technological momentum too strong. But it can slow it, and delay has consequences, measured not only in degrees of warming and catastrophic weather events, but equally important in lost development opportunities for countries and communities that can least afford to wait. So accelerating the transition and ensuring that the benefits of the transition are shared requires strengthened international cooperation and a strengthened multilateralism. And which brings me directly to China. China's role in the energy transition is central. And the signals China sends domestically and the bridges and partnerships it builds internationally will shape the pace and direction of the global transition. China has already demonstrated what is possible. Chinese manufacturing helped reduce the cost of clean energy technologies over the last decade, making renewable energy affordable and accessible for all. And China is also transforming its own energy system at extraordinary speed. In recent years, China has installed more solar and wind capacity annually than the rest of the world combined. Through these domestic policies and investment, China is sending a powerful signal to global markets that the transition from fossil fuels to clean energy is not a distant aspiration, but a structural transformation underway. China's clean energy expansion is helping to demonstrate that the transition is inevitable, unstoppable, and irreversible. At the same time, the global transition benefits from clear and consistent signals about the long-term direction of energy systems. As renewable deployment accelerates and battery storage technologies mature, future clarity clarity about the future role of coal will help reinforce confidence around markets, investors, and governments around the world. And greater visibility on the pathways for reducing coal reliance would therefore strengthen confidence in the transition and amplify the powerful signal that China's clean energy leadership is already sending. In addition, China's leadership will also be defined by the bridges and partnerships it builds internationally. Through cooperation on technology, critical energy transition minerals, infrastructure, finance, and industrial development, China has the opportunity to help ensure that the benefits of the clean energy transition reach countries across the developing world. The next phase of the transition will not only depend on national action, but on the partnerships that connect countries, enabling technology to spread faster, investment to flow further, and clean energy to become accessible to all. This is where China's leadership can make a decisive difference. And permit me to highlight 5 concrete areas where cooperation and China's leadership can help accelerate the global energy transition, even in this moment of division, turbulence, and geopolitical uncertainty. First, grids and storage. The biggest barrier to the clean energy transition today is no longer the cost of generating renewable power. It is the infrastructure needed to deliver it. Across the world, outdated grids and insufficient storage are slowing renewable deployment. Without modern grids and large-scale storage, the clean electricity revolution cannot move at the speed required. The IEA estimates that for every dollar invested in clean energy generation, just 40 cents is being invested in grids and storage. For us to be on track, we need that equation to be $1 invested in generation, $1 invested in grids. Second is resilient, clean energy supply chains. Solar panels, wind turbines, batteries, and critical minerals are the building blocks of the new energy system. Ensuring that supply chains remain open, resilient, and diversified will be essential to supporting rapid global deployment while strengthening energy security for all countries. Third, lowering the cost of capital. For many developing countries, the greatest barrier to clean energy is not technology, it is finance. A solar project in Europe may borrow at 3 or 4% interest. The same project in parts of Africa or South Asia may face financing costs 2 or 3 times higher. If the transition is to accelerate globally, we must bring down the cost of capital so that investment flows to where clean energy potential is greatest. One of the most alarming statistics is that since the Paris Agreement. 4 out of every $5 invested in clean energy has been invested in China and the advanced economies. This is great. But just $1 was invested, 1 out of every $5 was invested in the rest of the world. And the rest of the world is 2/3 of the world's population. So we really need to find ways of ensuring that finance flows to the developing world. And nowhere is this injustice greater than on the continent of Africa. 20% of the world's population, 60% of the world's best solar capacity, and yet it attracts just 2% of global clean energy investments. So addressing this issue of the cost of capital has to be one of our biggest priorities if we are to not only accelerate, but ensure that no one is left behind. Fourth is just and orderly transitions. The shift away from fossil fuels must be managed in a way that protects workers and communities whose livelihoods depend on today's energy systems. The clean energy transition must therefore be a jobs and development strategy, creating new industries, new skills, and new opportunities. Fifth is ensuring energy access for all. Nearly 800 million people still live without access to electricity, with 600 million people in Africa. And in Africa, 8 out of 10 persons live in rural or difficult to reach areas where decentralized renewables, mini grids, and storage can play a transformative role, bringing power directly to people and communities that have been left behind for decades. For them, the energy transition is not about climate. It is about development, it is about dignity and opportunity. So excellencies and friends and students, the energy transition will only succeed if it is fair, just, and global. Fragmented markets and geopolitical rivalry risk slowing down progress at precisely the moment acceleration is required. The clean energy transition must become a platform for cooperation, not another arena for geopolitical competition. And nearly a decade ago, the world came together in Paris to adopt a landmark agreement on climate change. And Minister Shea was one of the architects of this really good agreement. Before Paris, the world was heading towards 4 degrees Celsius of warming by the end of the century. Today, if the current national pledges or the nationally determined contributions are fully implemented, projected warming has fallen to around 2.3 to 2.5 degrees Celsius. This is still far from being safe, but it demonstrates something important. International cooperation works. The Paris Agreement sent a powerful signal to markets and innovators around the world. Today, every G20 country has some form of a net zero target. And as of today, countries representing close to 90% of global emissions have presented or formally announced new national climate plans or NDCs over the past year, including all but one G20 nation. In 2015, solar power was still emerging as an energy source and only represented around 16% of installed power capacity in 2015. Today, solar is dominating, and last year, solar represented 75% of all new power installed. In 2015, global clean energy investment was a fraction of what it is today. In 2015, less than 1% of all new cars sold were electric vehicles. By the end of this year, 1 in every 4 cars, or 25% of all cars sold globally, will be electric vehicles. So these transformations did not happen by accident. They happened because governments, markets, investors, and innovators responded to a shared signal that the world had chosen a different path. And that is the real power of multilateralism. There's a Chinese proverb that says, Tong, Jiao, Gong, Ji. We are all in the same boat, if I did not say it correctly. So, to the students here today, the scientists, the engineers, and entrepreneurs and leaders of tomorrow, or ambassadors of tomorrow, the future will soon be in your hands. My hope is that you will defend the spirit of cooperation that made the Paris Agreement possible and continue to accelerate the clean energy transition our shared future requires. Because the transition and the direction of travel is already clear. This transition is inevitable, it is unstoppable, and it is irreversible. But history will not judge us by direction alone. It will judge us on speed, fairness, and whether we seize this moment with the urgency it demands. And this is not solely or only a technological transition. It is a test of cooperation, a test of leadership, and a test of our collective will. The United Nations, under the leadership of the Secretary General, will continue to support these efforts. We will continue to work with China and all partners to accelerate the transition, strengthen cooperation, and ensure that no one is left behind. Because in the end, we're all in the same boat, and the course we set together will define the future we share. I thank you.
非常感谢哈德先生，我觉得在很短的时间里边，把这个非常精彩的讲了各个方面。So as I say, thank you very much. So in a very short time, you give a very full spectrum description about the importance of dealing with climate change and the importance for just energy transition. So I would like to promote another applause to thank his 请大家再次鼓掌，表达这个对他的这个演讲的感谢。下面呢，我们进入这个问答环节。看那个男同学，这每个问答同学来讲，你先介绍一下你自己是谁，从哪儿来。
Hi, Mr. Hart. I'm Yi Chen, and I'm one of the PhD candidates of Professor Li Zheng, and I'm also one of the youth representative of Tsinghua University who will attend the UN EcoSo Youth Forum next week. And my question is, we've mentioned that nowadays with the trust eroding, and many countries, they prioritizing the energy security and geopolitical competition over the cooperations. So how could UN's multilateral framework still remain effective in face of this kind of issue? Especially, specifically, what kind of steps could be taken in the crisis nowadays, like the Strait of Hormuz? Thank you.
That's a very good question, and it's a question that's central to our work moving forward. Now, 3 out of every 4 persons live in countries that are net importers of fossil fuels, right? And what this crisis is revealing, or it has revealed, is that this dependence is a structural vulnerability. Now, what makes this current crisis different from previous crises, like the oil shocks of the 1970s, the wars in the Middle East in the 90s and 2000s, and more recently, the war in Ukraine, is now, and the Secretary General recently said this, there's an exit ramp. There's an alternative to this continued dependence and reliance on imported fossil fuels, due in large part to the massive deployment and investments that China has made over the course of the last decade in clean energy. So the central question is, will countries use this crisis as a moment and an opportunity to accelerate the transition based on energy security reasons, but with significant benefits to our climate, right? So this is one, and it's a major choice that every country will be faced. But if you're a net importer of fossil fuels, it should be an extremely easy choice to make. But we will need international cooperation and strengthen multilateralism to address many of the systemic challenges that continue to hold this transition back. And I remain convinced, based on the evidence that we've seen, that countries remain committed on climate. It might not be at the top of the priority list at the moment, but countries remain committed. Countries remain committed on climate. And we know what those systemic issues are: access to finance and affordable finance. So issues like reform of the multilateral development banks to make finance cheaper for African countries and other developing countries. We are continuing to work on all of those issues. How can we get finance to the small island developing states and the least developed countries so that they can put early warning systems in place? Because we know that the climate crisis is getting worse, and countries need to protect people and communities from increasingly more intense and more frequent climate events. So we at the UN, we don't have lots of money, but we have the voice of the Secretary General, and he will continue to raise these issues with leaders. We have the power to convene. And last year, when we were facing a very difficult moment for the climate regime, the Secretary General and President Lula of Brazil, they convened a small group of leaders, including President Xi, Presidents van der Leyen and Costa, President Erdogan, and a number of other leaders. And this helped to put the climate process back on track. So we will use the power of the voice of the Secretary General, but also our convening power and the technical skills and capacity of the United Nations to help countries navigate this very difficult period. The reality is that there are forces who will be pushing back against multilateralism, but this is why it's absolutely important for leading countries like China, like the European Union, like India, like Brazil, countries that have so much in common, to remain firmly committed to the principles and the practice of multilateralism.
Thank you so much.
So before I give the question the right to ask questions for others, I would like to ask a very, my own question. So last year I joined COP30 in Brazil. So one of the topics in the COP30 is about the leadership, lackness of leadership after U.S. quitted from the Paris Agreement. So you're working and give advice to the Secretary General. So from your perspective, what's your expectation about Europe Union, and what's your thinking about role of China to play in the climate governance?
Thanks. So the U.S. has left the Paris Agreement. It's the second time. And no one else has left the Paris Agreement. Secondly, as of today, countries representing close to 90% of global emissions have submitted new nationally determined contributions or new national climate plans, meaning that these countries, including all but one country from the G20. So it means that all of the major countries, all of the major economies, they are living up to their obligations under the Paris Agreement. Now, we know that the level of ambition collectively of the indices don't take us to the 1.5 degree goal, but it shows nevertheless that countries remain committed to multilateralism and to this climate regime. Now, the role of China and the role of the EU individually and collectively is absolutely central, right? With the departure of the US from the Paris Agreement, these two countries, the EU is not a country, it's a bloc, but the EU and China working together will be absolutely critical to ensure that the regime stays on track. After COP30, my assessment is that the regime has transitioned from negotiation to implementation and delivery. There are no expectations of any big negotiated outcomes for the next few years. We already have the Paris Agreement. We have the UAE consensus. They all help to set the direction of travel internationally. Countries have submitted their NDCs. So the process, the COP process, really should now be serving to facilitate implementation. It should be serving to facilitate dialogue and to facilitate acceleration and delivery. What we need is for countries to work on addressing the barriers to implementation and acceleration in very concrete ways, rather than sitting around the table negotiating with each other. And we know what those barriers and challenges are. Those barriers and challenges are mainly financial for some countries. Some of those barriers are technological, for example, the need for grids and storage. And some of those barriers are political, right? So issues related to trade and tariffs. And so we really need to create, it will be essential that the European Union and China, they work in a cooperative and collaborative way to address these barriers among themselves, but also work together to ensure that this transition can also permeate towards third countries and to developing and emerging economies. So this is something that the Secretary General has been working on over the course of the last few years. How can we get, you will not agree, China and the EU, you will not agree on everything, but you have so much in common. You're net importers of fossil fuels. You're heavily dependent on, the EU is more, but heavily dependent on imported fossil fuels. It is in your collective interest to work together to accelerate the pace of the energy transition, to guarantee the energy security and sovereignty, and also to ensure the availability and affordability of energy both in China and the European Union. As I said, you will not agree on everything, but it's crucial that the EU and China work cooperatively and collectively to address these barriers and challenges. It will definitely help the rest of the world if China and the European Union have a cooperative and constructive relationship on climate and the energy transition.
Thank you. I see that gentleman, yes. Introduce yourself.
Hello, my name's Sean, and I'm a Brisbane grammar student from Australia. And I just have one question. So in your speech, you said that sustainability is really important and that it should be global. And I completely agree with this. But I just had one question. How do you propose that less economically developed regions invest in renewable energy when they have other issues such as poverty, which require more immediate action? Because you gave the example of millions of people living without electricity. So wouldn't these people prioritize electricity and other necessities over environmental protection?
Thanks. That's a very good question, and this is why the world has come up with this notion of sustainable development, right? That the economic, the social, and the environmental are interrelated and mutually reinforcing. And if we're able to provide electricity to the 800 million persons who currently lack electricity, right? This provides them with opportunity. It provides them with dignity. And if that electricity is clean, it is good for the environment, right? So I don't believe that development goals and objectives are separate and distinct from climate-related goals and objectives, right? And as we go further into the energy transition, right, it is absolutely clear that there are almost two sides of the same coin. The 600 million persons who lack access to electricity in Africa are in either rural or difficult to reach places, 8 out of 10, which means that a traditional coal-fired power plant or a gas-fired power plant that is not the solution to providing energy access to these 600 million persons. It is mini grids, it's solar, it's storage. So you're achieving a development objective. You're bringing electricity to individuals who've previously not had electricity, providing them with dignity and economic opportunities. But you're also, but they're also climate co-benefits. And the second point is that given that climate disproportionately impacts the poor and the most vulnerable, those who are least able and who have the least capacity to protect themselves, taking action on climate is absolutely essential to ensuring that these persons can have a dignified life. The reality is that, and I'll use just one example. We know that climate extremes are getting worse, right? So floods, droughts, heat waves, they are getting worse, and they're disproportionately impacting poor and vulnerable and fragile countries and communities. And Africa is by far the most vulnerable continent to the climate crisis. Yet 6 out of every 10 Africans are not covered by an effective early warning system. Right? So these individuals, 6 out of every 10 persons, are not covered by an effective early warning system. And a few years ago, one of our UN agencies did a survey, and they looked at observation equipment. And there was this one piece of observation equipment that they had more in Germany than the entire continent of Africa. An essential observation equipment for ensuring that early warning systems are effective. So my response is that I don't see climate and the development goals and outcomes separate and distinct, and that if individuals and countries are able to develop in a clean and sustainable way, without pollution, without carbon emissions, if vulnerable and poor countries and communities are protected from climate extremes, because offering protection from climate extremes is ultimately about saving lives and protecting livelihoods. And while it might be a climate measure or classified as a climate measure, the outcomes are development, right? So, I would take the perspective that it is one and the same thing, rather than climate versus development.
Now, on this room, we have more than 100 audience, students and some people from the society. And then we also opened on your lecture on the website. There are more than 800 people are listening. So I think that's worth applaud.
Hello, my name is Tao Spark, and I'm again one of the students here from Brisbane Grammar School. And what I wanted to ask you...
Where?
Brisbane Grammar School.
Australia.
Australia, yeah. And what I wanted to ask you was that you talked about the necessity for the acceleration of a transition for unsustainable energy to renewable energy. But how can we mitigate the use of fossil fuels in countries with a more vulnerable economy that can't support such implications as quickly?
Can you repeat that last part?
How can we mitigate the use of fossil fuels in countries with a more vulnerable economy that can't support such implications as quickly?
Okay. So the reality is that when you look at this transition, right, you have countries in different categories and different contexts. They have different resource endowments. And each country will need to have their own transition pathway, right? So a country that is endowed, and I believe that this is the question that you're asking, a country that is well endowed with fossil fuels like Australia will have a different transition pathway than a country which is a net importer of fossil fuels, right? And countries will need to plan these transitions. And one of the points that I made in the speech was that we really need international cooperation on the issue of a just and orderly transition. And the implications of a just and orderly transition for fossil fuel dependent countries, countries that are endowed with fossil fuels, will look completely different than a transition by a country that is not well endowed with fossil fuels. Because if these transitions, if you don't look at the implications of the transition on your workforce, there are 13 million people on this earth that are tied or employed directly by the fossil fuel sector. In China, I would imagine it's primarily in the coal sector, and there are regions that are heavily dependent on coal production. And if the transition is to be politically sustainable, countries will need to attend to the needs of these individuals, these workers and communities. And we've seen the impact of transitions that are not well managed. History is littered with transitions that are not well managed, and the social and political implications come back to haunt us sometimes decades after. So countries need to plan these transitions. And countries also need to understand the demand signals, right? Given everything that we're seeing, there is going to be a decline in demand for fossil fuels. So if you're a fossil fuel producing nation, should you make a 30-year investment in new expansion of fossil fuels when you know that given the declining cost of renewables, given all of the price signals and demand signals, that this could potentially be an investment in a stranded asset. So these are the very difficult questions and issues that every country will need to confront. But the transition pathway for every country is going to be different. And while we can learn from the experiences of other nations, each country will need to decide what its transition pathway looks like.
About your question, just to add some information, just to strengthen Mr. Hart's saying. So last month, I joined a broad forum and I met the ambassador of Australia in China. And he mentioned that the Israel-Iran war has caused tension for fossil energy, for oil supply. And that I said, fossil energy is not really safe. Yeah. Then Australia has only a few refineries, so need oil product import. But because of the supply tension, the countries who export oil product no longer want to do that. So that Australia is in a great risk for oil supply break. So I think that's why we need, as Mr. Hart said, that we need longer term solution is to do energy transition, to break the dependence on fossil energy. 我刚才看到有人举手，我看那个男同志。
Thank you so much. First, I feel honorable to be here because I graduated from American Hawaii University and I just went to New York. So I know a lot of things about that. And when I came back, I really hope that every people can be part of it, right? But actually, so many students or people, they just worry about their own job, right? They don't care about it. But actually, my question goes to is that how can developing countries can access affordable clean energy technologies to avoid locking in the fossil fuel infrastructures? Because as we know that this world is collapsed almost, right? So people will war and every time. So yeah, I think there must be some problem to be resolved, right? So I think this is privilege and it's also the duty-free job, right? So yeah, this is my question. So Jim might can answer that. Thank you.
Thanks. The reality is that the clean energy transition is not occurring fast enough in the developing world. That's a reality. As I said earlier, since the finalization of the Paris Agreement, 4 out of every $5 invested in clean energy has been invested in China, which is great, and the advanced economies. And just 1 out of every $5 was invested in the rest of the world. And that rest of the world is 2/3 of the global population. Last year, despite record renewable energy deployment, over close to 700 gigawatts of renewables were installed globally last year. The installation, the capacity installations in Africa, it was less than 12 gigawatts. right? So we have a situation where the developing world is being left behind in the energy transition. And this is a major focus of work for us in the United Nations. The technology is not a problem, thanks to China, right? You make the best, the cheapest and most efficient panels. The storage, the efficiency and the cost of storage has declined significantly over the course of the last decade, by over 90%, while it's a lot more efficient. The biggest problem is the cost of capital. Projects, renewable energy projects are what are sometimes called capital intensive. You pay for the technology upfront, right? Panels so you need capital upfront. You need to make that initial investment upfront. And there are mainly two ways. Either you need to borrow, you need to incur debt, or some form of equity financing. And the big challenge is that the cost of capital, how much it costs, whether it's debt or equity, is 2 to 3, sometimes even 4 or 5 times higher for most developing countries. And for African countries, a country like Pakistan, for example, the cost of capital is 4 to 5 times higher. So we need to address this cost of capital issue. We've been working with the multilateral development banks. We've been working with the credit rating agencies, because a lot of it is tied to the sovereign ratings of many of these countries, you know, and the perception of risk, that the investments are riskier in developing and emerging economies as opposed to the advanced economies. In addition, we're working to ensure that the policy and regulatory environments in these countries are more conducive to the types of investments that would attract investments in clean energy. So on the positive side, the technology and the cost of the actual cost of the technology is not a problem. It's in virtually every country in the world. Solar, storage, wind, any combination of those three is usually cheaper than fossil fuels. It takes 1 to 2 years to build a utility scale solar storage project. Wind is about 3 years. Traditional fossil fuels, you're waiting 5 to 6 years for a gas turbine, and a coal plant is 5 to 6 years. So renewables are cheaper, they're faster, they're secure, more secure. Once you install those panels, you put that storage up, or those turbines, you don't have to depend on imports from anywhere, China or right? And so renewables are by far the superior option. But we need, given the capital intensive nature of the investments, we need to address this cost of capital issue. And it requires collaboration and cooperation from the climate funds, the MDBs, private finance, because the business case is absolutely 100% clear. But we need to address this cost of capital issue so that we can really speed up the deployment of renewables in the developing countries, because that's the next phase of this transition. And we're already starting to see some positive results in places, in countries like India. Last year, India's wind and solar capacity doubled in 1 year. They installed about 45 gigawatts of wind and solar in 1 year, and that was double the capacity in 2024. Brazil, we're also seeing some major strides, but these are larger investment grade economies. We really need to ensure that this rapid deployment spreads to other countries and to other regions. And we can't do this until this issue of the cost of capital is addressed. But rest assured, it is being worked on not only by us in the UN system, but by the multilateral development banks and the climate funds. And we're trying to find creative and innovative solutions.
有没有清华的学生？
Good afternoon. Good afternoon, Mr. Hart. I'm also from Brisbane Grammar School from Australia. And
too many Australians
yeah.
in here.
Yeah, so you have emphasized the significance of acceleration in the transition. And during this transition, the younger generation will have higher pressures to pursue this transition. Therefore, it raised a thought to me, like which jobs or institutions will be required or more significant for younger generations to occupy to increase the rate of this transition? Or is this already a government-based project which future other jobs cannot participate as much into this change? Thank you.
Thanks. And it's a very good question, and it speaks generally to the future of work, right? Because jobs will not only be available in the renewable energy sector, but if we're able to significantly reduce the cost of electricity, because electricity is such a key component of any in any economy, and if we're able to significantly reduce the cost of electricity, it will create jobs in sectors probably that we haven't even thought about. I was born in the 1970s, and when I was born, we had no notion of the internet, right? We had these landlines, but the internet and connectivity, digital connectivity, has opened significantly new spheres of employment for that I never thought of when I was a boy growing up in Barbados. And I honestly see a parallel for the clean energy transition. If we're able to make energy so cheap and affordable, and everywhere, and so abundant, I believe that it will open new spheres of economic activity and opportunities that we probably never even thought of before. But let's also think about clean energy jobs versus jobs in the fossil fuel sector. And based on research from IRENA and the International Renewable Energy Agency, I need to stop using acronyms, right? But it shows that the renewable energy sector creates more jobs, cleaner jobs, than in the fossil fuel sector. And I know, for example, within Europe, there are lots of concerns around, well, if we import clean energy technologies from China, it will kill jobs in Europe. The evidence does not back that up. 60 to 70% of all jobs in the clean energy sector are jobs based on installation, maintenance, and it's just, and most of them are not low-paying jobs because a lot of this is highly technical skill work. So 60 to 70% of the jobs are not on the manufacturing side of the aisle, but on the upstream installation, downstream installation and maintenance part of clean energy technologies. So it's irrational and unrealistic to believe that there will be a solar panel factory in every country of the world. That's unrealistic. It's inefficient and it's unrealistic. But countries will see jobs, lots of clean and new jobs on the installation, on maintenance. And as I said, there will be new opportunities because if we're able to address issues around grids and flexibility, will require high technology. They're technologically intensive jobs, and many of the advanced economies, the European countries, they have a comparative advantage already in many of these technologies. So I believe that the job benefits, not believe, all of the evidence shows that the job benefits of the clean energy sector far outweigh the jobs that will be created in the fossil fuel sector. And if we're able to have, free and clean and abundant electricity, as we did decades ago with digital connectivity, I anticipate that there will be new and amazing employment opportunities for young people.
So I fully agree with your saying. So I'll give you some example just to stress your saying. In China, in the countryside, there are a lot of families installing PV panels on their roof, so they gain benefit from installation, and they can. I think in 6 years they can recover their investment, and then from then it's a fully pure income. That's one thing. The other thing is that I see some installers of such panels, PV panels. So I know they were just farmers previously. They do farming in their home, but now they get trained, and there are a lot of businesses. So they form a team to help install PV panels in the countryside and across China. So the employment is because there are so many panels to install. So I think so the employment increased a lot. So that's the evidence to your saying. And actually, I know there are still a lot of questions, but I personally had a question because to make use of the best chance to ask. So unilateral measures was seriously discussed in COP30. So such kind of measures like CBAM caused a lot of argument. I think a lot of developing countries think that hinders their climate actions. So how do you think, in your opinion, is that how can we solve such kind of unilateral measures to transfer them into multilateral to benefit the global climate action?
Thanks. And this question is one, I believe is the perfect example. Is a perfect example of how the multilateral climate process needs to evolve from negotiation to implementation, acceleration, and delivery. In my view, the process needs to now become a place to facilitate implementation, delivery, and acceleration by precisely creating a safe space for dialogue on these barriers, these potential barriers or concerns that could potentially hinder implementation, acceleration, and delivery. And this was raised, this issue of unilateral measures and trade, it was raised by many developing countries at COP30 in Brazil. And there was a back and forth between the developed and the developing countries. And the Secretary General, when he met with leaders from both sides, he met with China, he met with India, he met with South Africa, the African countries, and as well as the EU, UK, Canada, and others. He made the point that it was clear that the climate process could not decide, but there needed to be a space for dialogue. There needed to be a space for dialogue between the different parties to better understand the implications of these measures, the implications of linkages between trade and climate, and how trade and climate could be mutually supportive of each other. Because we need an open trading system, and unilateral measures, it's mentioned in the Climate Convention, and unilateral measures really should not be a barrier for climate ambition. So we were very happy that there was an outcome at COP30 to create a dialogue on trade and climate. And we will continue to insist, and that dialogue will be informed by inputs from the International Trade Council or Commission in Geneva, WTO, UNCTAD. These are the parts of the UN system that have responsibility for trade policy and rulemaking on trade. So we're hoping that this dialogue provides a safe space to bring the trade and the climate community together, to have that type of dialogue to address the legitimate concerns of the developing countries who raise this issue. And I honestly see this as a positive, right? The developing countries raised this as an issue, and there was a response, the creation of this dialogue to address this issue.
Still more questions, hard questions. So in COP29 in Baku, so the agreement has been reached for the NCQG. That means $300 billion by developing countries. By developed countries to mobilize, and there's also a $1.3 trillion the target. So how do you think the prospect of such kind of target, and do you see substantial measures to realize them, especially when the U.S. quit, no longer inside the Paris Agreement?
If I'm brutally honest, it's really going to be challenging to meet these finance goals. And it's also concerning that less than 2 years after the adoption of this agreement on the new collective quantified goal. You're seeing many developed countries backslide and backtrack on their climate finance commitments, right? We have asked that as a minimum, you maintain the current levels, and that we hope that in future years, if the US rejoins the process, then they could be a sprint as we get closer to 2035. But it is concerning and disconcerting that some of the developed countries, less than 2 years after Baku, have started to fall back on their climate finance commitments that were agreed on at COP29. This does not build trust. It erodes trust. And we're hoping that hopefully as a political environment improves, that developed countries will revisit some of the announcements that have been recently made. But that being said, I think it's also critical that we explore the possibility of new and innovative sources of finance as well, of course, which don't place a burden on developing countries. But it is crucial that we cannot give up on the commitments of the developed countries, but we also need to explore new and creative and innovative sources of financing. And there are many models, solidarity levies, debt swaps. There are many new and innovative instruments that we will need to scale up as well. And finally, the role of the multilateral development banks will also be key. And the multilateral development banks, they've all made commitments on climate finance, and it remains our hope that these multilateral development banks will also live up to what they promise at a minimum at COP29 in Baku. What is also concerning is that 10 years after Paris, adaptation finance, which is absolutely critical, which is critical for the vulnerable developing countries, that adaptation finance continues to lag behind mitigation finance. And there's a very clear business case for mitigation finance, and a lot of it can be done by the private sector, but adaptation finance requires public money in most instances. Yes, some of it can be done by the private sector, but in most instances, adaptation finance, given the nature of adaptation finance, it is public money. And our view is that adaptation finance needs to be prioritized. So therefore, these cuts that we're seeing from many of the developed countries, the implications are dire. And when you look at these cuts against what the science is telling us, the science is telling us that we will overshoot. There will be a temporary overshoot of the 1.5 degree limit. And this means that the heat waves that we're seeing all over the world, including China, and Minister Xie told me about the heat waves that he recently experienced. These heat waves, these storms, these droughts are going to get worse in the short term. A lot of the impacts that we're currently seeing or will see in the not too distant future, we thought would happen 10, 15, 20 years from now. But many of them are happening now. So the need for adaptation and resilience, finance to protect people, to save lives, it's an urgent priority, and we're really hoping that that countries will rethink some of these cuts, given what we know about the inevitability of overshooting the 1.5 degree limit.
I noticed we are using up our time. However, there are 800 people on the website. So I would like to give a last question to our students on the web. So maybe you can read the question.
Oh, yes. A graduate student from Tsinghua University who was listening online raised a question about funding for energy transition in Africa. His question is that how can the United Nations promote international financial organizations such as the World Bank to lead and support energy transformation in regions such as Africa?
Thanks. Unlike the World Bank, we don't have, we're not a bank. The UN is not a bank. So we don't have the capital of the World Bank. But we work very closely with the World Bank, right? We work very closely with the World Bank and the other international financial institutions and multilateral development banks. So the tools that we have are the voice of the Secretary General, our ability to convene, and he convenes, as well as the technical capacities of within the UN system, right? So we have many UN system entities, UNDP, they lead our development work, so they work on projects and capacity building, and we have a range of UN system entities. So we use these three tools to address many of the problems and challenges that developing countries face, and you know, you raise the question of African countries. So we've convened on this issue. We bring providers of finance together, parts of the system. Our colleagues at one of the entities called Sustainable Energy for All, they're working with the World Bank and other entities on an initiative called Mission 300, which is designed to provide energy access to 300 million persons in Africa by I think it's 2030 or 2035. So we're part of initiatives like that. Many of the UN system entities are regional, the African Regional Commission, they're working with African countries to help to improve the policy and regulatory environment for clean energy investments and renewable energy investments. We've used the convening power of the Secretary General to create a set of principles and standards on critical energy transition minerals so that resource-rich developing countries, including African countries, can enhance the benefits and value from the critical energy transition minerals that they have. But the bottom line is that ensuring that this transition is fair and that we leave no one behind is a priority of the United Nations, and we constantly raise there is no continent where the injustice of the energy transition is more evident than the continent of Africa, and this is one of our priorities that the entire system continues to work on. And even in the absence of the capital base of the World Bank and being able to massively invest. We use the tools that we have at our availability to ensure that this is a priority for the international community and that we can drive the type of change that is so desperately needed to provide energy access to the 600 million people in Africa. And you know, the continent has 60% of the best solar capacity in the world, right? The solar capacity in Africa could power the entire world. 60% the best solar capacity, and yet it attracts just 2%. And when we look back at this period, I hope that future generations will positively judge us as really ensuring using the opportunity of the clean energy transition as an opportunity to ensure everyone on Earth has access to electricity, rather than judge us as failing to deliver, despite the vast opportunities of clean energy, failing to close the energy access gap. So I am confident that option one, we will close this energy access gap. I am confident and hopeful that we will be able to close this energy access gap. And clean energy provides us with the best opportunity possible.
Thank you。所以我们这个时间关系呢，就到此就这个问答环节就结束了。让我们为我们的观众和哈特先生的精彩的对话鼓掌，表示感谢。我今天和这个哈特先生这个听他的演讲，我觉得这个金句特别多。我当然也记得有几个非常印象深刻的。一个来讲呢，就是能源转型是我们当代最大的发展机会之一。我觉得这个话讲得非常的精辟，非常的深刻。另外一个讲呢，就这个能源转型呢，需要对这合作实际上是对合作精神的考验。没有合作，这件事做不了成。最后来他讲呢，不能让一个人掉队，不能让一个大猪掉队。我觉得都是非常非常这个金句频出，所以我非常这个收获。我相信大家跟我的感受是一样的，所以我们对这个哈特先生呢鼓掌表示感谢。然后我们另外呢，我们还有一个经典的节目，就是我这个为了这个感谢哈特先生对我们大讲堂这个做客，对我们大讲堂的贡献，所以我们有请那个谢振华主任呢，这个给您授纪念牌，对您的贡献表示这个 appreciation。亨利大使，你也上来。